He thought she was just another servant. But when the millionaire saw his maid carrying his twins, he discovered that sometimes the help you dismiss holds the most precious secrets of your life. The sound of crying babies at 6 in the morning was not what Robert Blackwood expected to hear in his penthouse suite. He had specifically chosen the 42nd floor of Manhattan's most exclusive residential tower, precisely because it was supposed to be soundproof, isolated from the chaos of ordinary life below. Yet here he was, being jolted awake by the unmistakable wails of infants. Robert sat up in his king-sized bed, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair that now looked disheveled from sleep. At 35, he was the youngest CEO in his company's history, having inherited Blackwood Industries from his father and transformed it into a global empire worth $3 billion. He was accustomed to silence, order, and complete control over his environment. The crying continued, and Robert felt his jaw clench with irritation. He had specifically instructed his building manager that families with small children were not suitable for this residential tower. The monthly maintenance fees alone should have filtered out anyone who couldn't afford proper childcare or, at minimum, soundproofing. He grabbed his silk robe and stormed out of his bedroom, following the sound through his sprawling penthouse. The crying seemed to be coming from the direction of the kitchen, which made no sense whatsoever. His private chef didn't arrive until 8, and his housekeeper wasn't scheduled until afternoon. As Robert approached the kitchen, he could hear a woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing what sounded like a lullaby in Spanish. The crying had stopped, replaced by gentle cooing sounds that somehow made his irritation spike even higher. Someone was in his kitchen without permission, and they had brought children with them. He rounded the corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Standing at his kitchen sink was a young woman he had never seen before, wearing a simple uniform and yellow cleaning gloves. But what made Robert's breath catch wasn't her presence. It was the sight of 2 identical baby carriers strapped to her body, one in front and one in back, each containing what appeared to be a tiny infant. The woman was washing dishes with practiced efficiency, while simultaneously swaying gently to keep the babies calm. She seemed completely absorbed in her work, humming softly while occasionally making little clicking sounds with her tongue that made the babies gurgle with contentment. "Excuse me," Robert said sharply, causing the woman to spin around in surprise. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my kitchen?" The woman's eyes went wide with shock, and Robert noticed they were a striking shade of green that seemed to hold depths he couldn't immediately fathom. She was younger than he had first assumed, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and a face that would have been quite beautiful if not for the obvious exhaustion etched around her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood," she said in accented English, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm Isabella Rodriguez. The cleaning service sent me to cover for Maria while she's sick." "I didn't mean to wake you." "The cleaning service sent you?" Robert repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "And they told you it was appropriate to bring your children to work?" Isabella's face flushed red, and she instinctively adjusted the baby carriers protectively. "No, sir. This is an emergency. My babysitter canceled at the last minute, and I couldn't afford to miss work." "I promise the babies won't be any trouble. They sleep most of the time." Robert looked at the woman with growing disbelief. She was standing in his kitchen, wearing babies-like accessories, and expecting him to be understanding about her childcare problems. The audacity was breathtaking. "Miss Rodriguez, I don't care about your personal circumstances. This is completely unacceptable. I specifically pay for professional cleaning services, not a daycare center." "Please, Mr. Blackwood," Isabella said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "I really need this job. I can clean just as well with the babies. They're very good, very quiet. You won't even know they're here." "I already know they're here because they woke me up with their crying," Robert snapped. "And frankly, I find it highly unprofessional that someone would think it's appropriate to bring infants into a client's home without permission." Isabella's shoulders sagged, and Robert could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but he quickly suppressed it. He hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by being soft-hearted about other people's problems. "How old are they?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. 4 months, Isabella replied quietly. "They're twins, Emma and Lucas." Robert studied the babies more closely. They were indeed identical, with the same dark hair and solemn expressions as they gazed around his kitchen with wide, curious eyes. Something about their faces seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. And their father. Is he aware that you're dragging his children around to cleaning jobs? Isabella's expression hardened slightly, and Robert caught a flash of something defiant in her green eyes. Their father isn't in the picture, Mr. Blackwood. It's just me and them. Of course it is, Robert muttered, his prejudices confirming themselves in his mind. Another single mother making poor life choices and expecting the world to accommodate her situation. Miss Rodriguez, I'm going to make this very simple for you. You can either find alternative arrangements for your children and return to finish the job properly, or you can leave now and I'll request a different cleaner from the service. Isabella stood very still for a moment, her hands resting protectively on the baby carriers. Robert could practically see her mind working, calculating options and probably realizing she had very few. I understand, Mr. Blackwood, she said finally. I'll call my neighbor and see if she can watch them for a few hours, but please, could I just finish this one room first? I promise I'll work quickly. Robert checked his expensive watch. He had a board meeting at 9, which gave him less than 3 hours to shower, eat breakfast, and review his presentation materials. Having a cleaning woman and 2 babies disrupting his morning routine was the last thing he needed. 15 minutes, he said curtly. Then I want you and your children out of here. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Thank you so much. Isabella immediately turned back to the sink and began washing dishes with impressive speed and efficiency. Robert found himself standing there watching her work, noting how she managed to maintain perfect balance even with the additional weight of 2 babies, how her movements were economical and practiced. One of the babies, Emma or Lucas, he couldn't tell which, began to fuss slightly, and Isabella immediately began humming again while continuing to wash dishes. The sound was oddly soothing, and Robert realized he had never heard anyone sing in his kitchen before. Where did you learn to clean? He asked, again surprising himself with his curiosity. My mother taught me, Isabella replied without turning around. She cleaned houses for 20 years. She always said that if you're going to do work, you should do it with pride, no matter what kind of work it is. And is that what you plan to do? Clean houses for 20 years while raising 2 children alone? Isabella's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. I plan to do whatever it takes to take care of my children, Mr. Blackwood. Right now that means cleaning houses. Tomorrow maybe it means something else. There was something in her tone that suggested hidden depths, plans and dreams that she wasn't sharing. Robert found himself oddly intrigued, despite his irritation. What did you do before you had children? I was studying, Isabella said simply. Pre-med at Columbia University. Robert felt his eyebrows rise. Pre-med? At Columbia? Full scholarship, Isabella added, and Robert caught a note of pride in her voice. I was going to be a pediatric surgeon. Was going to be. What happened? Isabella turned around then, and Robert saw a complexity of emotions cross her face. Sadness, determination, and something that looked like carefully controlled anger. Life happened, Mr. Blackwood. Sometimes plans change when you become responsible for other people. She turned back to the dishes, but Robert continued to watch her. A full scholarship to Columbia for pre-med was not something that was handed out lightly. This woman washing his dishes had once been considered brilliant enough to become a doctor. Your 15 minutes are up, he said, though he realized he had been standing there for at least 20 minutes. Isabella dried her hands and turned to face him. Thank you for letting me finish the kitchen. I'll call the service and arrange for someone else to complete the rest of your home. As she began to walk toward the door, one of the babies started crying again. Isabella immediately began that soft humming, swaying slightly as she walked, and the crying stopped almost instantly. Miss Rodriguez, Robert called out, causing her to turn back. How often does the regular cleaner come here? Maria comes twice a week, Mr. Blackwood, Tuesdays and Fridays. And how long has she been cleaning for me? 3 years, I think. Robert nodded slowly. 3 years. And he had never bothered to learn anything about Maria beyond the fact that she did adequate work. He certainly had never wondered if she had children, or dreams, or circumstances beyond his need for clean surfaces. I'll expect the replacement cleaner to be more conventional, he said finally. Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. As Isabella walked toward the elevator with her babies, Robert remained standing in his kitchen, staring at the spotless dishes and gleaming countertops. The work was flawless, better than he had ever seen it done before. But more than that, something about the woman herself lingered in his mind. The way she had carried herself with dignity despite being dismissed, the pride in her voice when she mentioned Colombia, the gentle competence with which she handled both her work and her children simultaneously. Robert shook his head, annoyed with himself for dwelling on the personal circumstances of service staff. He had more important things to focus on than the life story of a single mother who made poor choices. Yet as he prepared for his shower, he found himself wondering what circumstances could cause someone to give up a full scholarship to Columbia and a future as a pediatric surgeon to clean houses while carrying babies. The thought bothered him more than he cared to admit, and Robert Blackwood was not accustomed to being bothered by things beyond his control. What he didn't realize was that his carefully controlled world was about to be turned completely upside down, and the woman he had just dismissed would be the one holding all the answers to questions he didn't even know he should be asking. Robert's board meeting was a disaster. For the first time in his career, he found himself distracted, his mind wandering to green eyes and the sound of Spanish lullabies. When the chief financial officer asked about quarterly projections, Robert had to ask him to repeat the question twice. "Are you feeling all right, Alex?" asked Margaret Chen, his longest-serving board member. "You seem elsewhere today." Robert straightened his tie and forced his attention back to the conference room. "I'm fine. Just reviewing some personnel issues." But he wasn't fine. Something about Isabella Rodriguez had gotten under his skin, and he couldn't shake the image of her carrying those babies while maintaining such dignity in the face of his dismissal. After the meeting, Robert returned to his office and did something he had never done before. He called the cleaning service directly. "Premium Home Services. This is Janet speaking. This is Robert Blackwood. I had an incident with one of your workers this morning, Isabella Rodriguez." "Oh no, Mr. Blackwood, I'm so sorry." Isabella explained about the emergency with her babysitter. "We've already arranged for a different cleaner to handle your account. Actually, I'm calling because I want to know more about Miss Rodriguez. How long has she worked for you?" Janet hesitated. "About 6 months, sir. She's one of our most reliable workers, but I understand the situation this morning was highly inappropriate." "6 months? And before that?" "I believe she was a student, sir." "Look, Mr. Blackwood, if you're concerned about any damage or theft—" "No, nothing like that. I want her back." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Robert wondered if the call had dropped. "Sir, you want Isabella back?" "Tomorrow. Same time. But tell her to arrange proper childcare." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. She'll be thrilled." Robert hung up, unsure why he had made that decision. He told himself it was because the quality of her work had been exceptional, but deep down he knew that wasn't the whole truth. The next morning, Robert positioned himself in his home office, where he could observe the kitchen without being seen. Isabella arrived precisely on time, alone this time, and immediately began working with the same quiet efficiency he remembered. She moved differently without the babies, quicker but somehow less complete, as if part of her was missing. Robert found himself wondering where Emma and Lucas were, who was watching them, whether they were safe. After an hour of pretending to work while actually watching Isabella clean, Robert finally walked into the kitchen. "Good morning, Miss Rodriguez." Isabella startled, dropping the cleaning cloth she was holding. "Mr. Blackwood, I didn't hear you come in. Where are the babies today?" "With my neighbor, Mrs. Martinez. She watches them when I work." Isabella's voice was carefully neutral, professional. "I want to thank you for giving me another chance." Robert nodded, studying her face. Up close, he could see the exhaustion was still there. Dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. "Columbia University," he said suddenly. "Pre-med, full scholarship. That's quite an achievement." Isabella's hands stilled on the counter she was cleaning. "Yes, sir." "What was your focus? What kind of research were you doing?" "Pediatric cardiac surgery. I was working on minimally invasive techniques for congenital heart defects." Robert felt his eyebrows rise. That level of specialization suggested someone who wasn't just smart, but brilliant. That's highly specialized work. Competitive field. "Very competitive," Isabella agreed, resuming her cleaning with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. "Isabella," Robert said, surprising himself by using her first name. "Can I ask you something personal?" She turned to face him, wariness creeping into her expression. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. The babies, Emma and Lucas, They're quite beautiful. Thank you. They have very distinctive features. Strong jawline, defined cheekbones, almost aristocratic. Isabella went very still, her cleaning cloth frozen in her hand. Something shifted in her expression, a carefully maintained mask slipping just slightly. Mr. Blackwood, I should get back to work. Of course, Robert said, but he didn't move. It's just that they remind me of someone. I can't quite place who. Isabella turned back to the counter, but Robert could see tension in every line of her body. People say babies change so much in their first year. Hard to say who they'll look like when they grow up. Robert mused, moving closer. 4 months old, you said? Yes, sir. Robert did quick mental calculations. 4 months ago would have been... He stopped, his mind suddenly racing. 4 months ago had been June. In June he had been... Where had he been in June? The charity gala. The environmental fundraiser, where he had drunk too much champagne and made too many poor decisions. Where he had met... Robert's world tilted as memory crashed over him like a wave. The beautiful graduate student. The conversation about medical research. The hotel room. The morning after when she was gone, leaving only a note thanking him for a lovely evening. Isabella Rodriguez. She had given him a different last name that night. But those green eyes, that melodic voice, it was definitely her. Which meant Emma and Lucas weren't just any babies. They were his children. Robert stood frozen in his kitchen, the world around him suddenly feeling surreal. Everything fell into place with devastating clarity. The familiar features of the babies, Isabella's evasiveness about their father, the timeline that matched perfectly with their encounter at the charity gala. Emma and Lucas weren't just any children. They were his children. Isabella, he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. We need to talk. She continued cleaning the counter with mechanical precision, but Robert could see her shoulders tense. I'm almost finished with the kitchen, Mr. Blackwood. I'll move to the living room next. Look at me. Something in his tone made her freeze. Slowly she turned around, and Robert saw in her eyes that she knew. She had always known this moment would come. The environmental fundraiser gala, last June. The Meridian Hotel. Robert's words were measured, controlled, but his heart was racing. You were there as a guest speaker about medical research funding. Isabella's face went pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. I don't know what you're talking about. Isabella Martinez. That's what you told me your name was. You were wearing a green dress that matched your eyes. We talked about your research on pediatric heart surgery. You said you were passionate about helping children who couldn't help themselves. Mr. Blackwood, I really should. You left before I woke up, Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. Left a note saying thank you for a lovely evening. No phone number, no last name, nothing. Isabella's hands were trembling now, but she stood her ground. That was a different person, Mr. Blackwood, a different life. Was it? Because I'm looking at those babies, and I'm seeing my father's jawline, my mother's nose, my own eyes looking back at me. The pretense crumbled. Isabella's carefully maintained composure shattered, and Robert saw the young woman from that night, brilliant, passionate, vulnerable, hiding beneath the defensive armor of the cleaning woman. What do you want from me? She whispered. I want the truth. Are Emma and Lucas my children? Isabella was quiet for so long that Robert wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Yes. The single word hit Robert like a physical blow. Even though he had known, hearing it confirmed made everything real in a way that stole his breath. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded. Why didn't you contact me when you found out you were pregnant? Isabella's laugh was bitter, hollow. Contact you? How exactly was I supposed to do that, Robert? I didn't even know your last name until I saw you on the news months later. You could have reached out through my company through your company? Isabella's voice rose, anger finally breaking through her careful control. Hi, Mr. Blackwood's secretary. I'm a cleaning woman who claims I slept with your billionaire boss. Could you please put me through? Robert felt heat rise in his cheeks. She was right, of course. His security, his people, his entire life was designed to keep exactly this kind of situation from reaching him. But you found me anyway, he said. You took a job cleaning my home. That wasn't coincidence. Isabella's eyes flashed with something between shame and defiance. No, it wasn't coincidence. When I found out I was pregnant with twins, I tried to research you. I wanted to know what kind of man fathered my children. And what did you find? I found a billionaire CEO who changes girlfriends like most people change clothes. I found society page photos of you with different supermodels every month. I found articles about your business ruthlessness, your reputation for discarding people when they're no longer useful. Each word was like a knife, cutting deep because Robert recognized the truth in them. So you decided what? To spy on me? I decided to see for myself what kind of father my children might have. Whether you were someone who could be trusted with their lives. By taking a job as my maid? By seeing how you treat people you consider beneath you. By watching how you interact with service staff. Whether you show basic human decency to people who can't benefit your career. Robert stared at her, understanding dawning. You've been testing me. I've been protecting my children, Isabella corrected fiercely. Emma and Lucas are the most important things in my life. I wasn't going to introduce some stranger into their world without knowing who he really was. And what conclusion did you reach? Isabella was quiet for a moment, studying his face. You want the truth? I want the truth. You failed the test, Robert. Spectacularly. The words hit him harder than any business failure ever had. What do you mean? Yesterday morning, when you found me here with the babies, your first instinct was to throw us out. You didn't ask if we needed help. If there was an emergency, if the children were safe. You just wanted us gone because we were inconvenient. Robert felt something crack inside his chest. I didn't know they were my children. It shouldn't matter whose children they were, Isabella shot back. A decent person sees a woman struggling with 2 infants and offers help, not judgment. A good man asks if there's anything he can do, not how quickly she can disappear. You're not used to treating service workers like human beings, Isabella finished. I've watched you, Robert. I've seen how you interact with your doorman, your driver, your delivery people. You don't see them as real people with real lives and real struggles. The accusations stung because they were true. Robert had never thought about the personal lives of the people who served him. They were functionaries, part of the machinery that kept his life running smoothly. That's not fair, he said weakly. Isn't it? When was the last time you asked your driver about his family? When did you last learn the name of the woman who cleans your office? Do you know anything about the people whose labor makes your comfortable life possible? Robert opened his mouth to respond and realized he couldn't. He didn't know any of those things. Had never thought to ask. I needed to know if you were the kind of man who could love children who didn't fit into your perfect world, Isabella continued. Children who might cry at inconvenient times, who might need you to sacrifice your comfort for their well-being. And you decided I wasn't. I decided you weren't ready, Isabella said more gently. Maybe someday you could be, but not now. Not yet. Robert felt the weight of her judgment, and worse, the recognition that it was probably accurate. What does that mean for Emma and Lucas? What does that mean for us? There is no us, Robert. There never was. That night at the gala was just a moment. A mistake that resulted in 2 beautiful children I wouldn't trade for anything. They're my children too. Biologically, yes. But being a father requires more than DNA. It requires sacrifice, patience, unconditional love. It requires putting someone else's needs before your own, every single day. You don't think I'm capable of that? Isabella looked at him with something that might have been pity. I think you're capable of many things, Robert. But loving someone more than you love yourself? I'm not sure you've ever learned how to do that. The truth in her words was devastating. Robert had spent his entire adult life building walls around himself, focusing solely on achievement and accumulation. The idea of loving someone unconditionally, of putting their needs first, was foreign to him. Isabella, please, give me a chance. Let me try to be the father they deserve. Why? She asked simply. Why now? Because you found out they exist? Because your conscience is bothering you? Or because you genuinely want what's best for Emma and Lucas? Robert struggled to answer, realizing he wasn't entirely sure himself. The discovery had shaken him profoundly, but was his desire to be involved motivated by love for the children, or by his own need to control the situation? I don't know, he admitted finally. I honestly don't know, but I want to find out. Isabella studied his face for a long moment, and Robert thought he saw something soften in her expression. Then prove it, she said quietly. Don't prove you can provide for them financially. They don't need your money. Prove you can love them more than you love yourself. Prove you can put their happiness before your own convenience. How? Figure it out, Robert. If you really want to be their father, figure out how to become the kind of man who deserves to be. With that, Isabella gathered her cleaning supplies and walked toward the door, leaving Robert alone in his pristine kitchen, with the weight of a truth that changed everything. Robert spent the rest of that day in a haze, unable to focus on any of his usual work. Every time he tried to review quarterly reports or approve marketing campaigns, his mind drifted to two tiny faces with his own eyes looking back at him. By evening, he found himself standing in his walk-in closet, staring at rows of expensive suits that suddenly felt like costumes for a role he was no longer sure he wanted to play. He had children, two babies who were growing up without knowing they had a father, being raised by a woman who cleaned houses to survive, because he had been too selfish and thoughtless to even ask her last name. The weight of that reality was crushing in a way that no business crisis had ever been. The next morning, Robert did something unprecedented. He cancelled all his meetings and drove to Isabella's neighborhood. He had used his resources to find her address, a modest apartment building in Queens that looked worn but clean. He sat in his Tesla outside the building for over an hour, watching residents come and go, trying to work up the courage to knock on her door. Finally, an elderly woman emerged from the building carrying grocery bags, struggling slightly with their weight. Without thinking, Robert got out of his car and approached her. "Excuse me, let me help you with those." The woman looked surprised, but allowed him to take the heavier bags. "Thank you, young man. These old arms aren't what they used to be." "Do you live in this building?" Robert asked as they walked toward the entrance. 23 years, she replied proudly. "I'm Mrs. Martinez. And you are?" Robert's breath caught. This was Isabella's neighbor, the woman watching Emma and Lucas. "I'm Robert. I'm a friend of Isabella Rodriguez." Mrs. Martinez stopped walking and studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Robert? The baby's father." The directness of the question startled him. "She told you about me. Child, Isabella doesn't have to tell me anything. Those babies have your eyes, your jaw, your stubborn chin. I've been watching children for 70 years. I know genetics when I see them." They continued walking, Mrs. Martinez leading him into the building's small lobby. "The question is, what are you doing here now?" Isabella's been struggling alone for months, working herself to exhaustion to take care of those babies. "I only just found out about them," Robert said quietly. "Found out? Or chose to find out?" Mrs. Martinez asked pointedly. "There's a difference, you know." Robert felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I had no idea Isabella was pregnant. She never contacted me." "And why do you think that was?" The question hung in the air as they reached Mrs. Martinez's floor. She invited him into her small but immaculately clean apartment, where Robert could hear the familiar sound of babies babbling from the next room. "They're here?" Robert asked, his heart suddenly racing. "Isabella's at work. I watch them during the day." Mrs. Martinez studied his face. "You want to see them, don't you?" Robert nodded, unable to trust his voice. Mrs. Martinez led him to a small living room, where Emma and Lucas were lying on a colorful playmat, reaching for hanging toys with chubby fingers. Seeing them up close, awake and alert, Robert was struck by how much they had grown, even in the few days since he'd first seen them. "They're beautiful," he whispered. "They're good babies," Mrs. Martinez said, settling into a chair. "Emma's more serious. Studies everything carefully before making decisions. Lucas is more adventurous, always trying to grab things just out of reach." Robert knelt beside the playmat, watching his children with wonder. Emma noticed him first, her dark eyes focusing on his face with startling intensity. She seemed to be evaluating him, making judgments about his worthiness with the same thoroughness her mother had shown. "She's cautious like Isabella," Mrs. Martinez observed. "Lucas is more trusting." As if to prove her point, Lucas gurgled and reached toward Robert's face. Without thinking, Robert extended his finger, and the baby grasped it with surprising strength. "He's strong," Robert said, emotion thick in his voice. "Takes after his father, I imagine." Mrs. Martinez's tone was neutral, but Robert sensed layers of meaning beneath her words. "Mrs. Martinez, can I ask you something? How is Isabella really doing? I mean, beyond the surface?" The elderly woman was quiet for a long moment, watching Robert's interaction with the babies. "She's drowning. but she's too proud to ask for help. Works 3 different cleaning jobs, takes online courses when the babies sleep, studies medical journals like she's still planning to be a doctor someday. 3 jobs? Your penthouse twice a week, an office building downtown on weekends, and a few private homes when she can get the work. Sometimes 16-hour days, but she never complains. Robert felt sick. While he lived in luxury, the mother of his children was working herself to exhaustion just to survive. What about family? Support? Parents died in a car accident when she was 19. No siblings. No extended family. It's just her and the babies. The isolation Isabella must feel suddenly became real to Robert in a way it hadn't before. She was completely alone, carrying the entire weight of raising 2 children with no safety net. No one to help when she was sick or exhausted or overwhelmed. She mentioned she was studying pre-med at Columbia, Robert said. Mrs. Martinez nodded sadly. Full scholarship, top of her class. Had to withdraw when she found out she was pregnant with twins. Couldn't afford childcare and medical school simultaneously. But she's still studying. Dreams don't die easy, especially when you're that smart. She takes online prerequisite courses, keeps up with medical journals, tells herself maybe someday she can go back. Robert understood now why Isabella looked at him with such controlled anger. He represented not just the father who had abandoned his children, but the privileged world that made her dreams impossible to pursue. Does she know I'm here? No, and I won't tell her unless you want me to. But let me give you some advice, young man. Robert looked up from where Lucas was now gripping his finger and trying to bring it to his mouth. Isabella doesn't need your money. She needs your respect. She doesn't need you to rescue her. She needs you to prove you're worthy of these children. How do I do that? Stop thinking like a rich man trying to solve a problem with his wallet. Start thinking like a father who wants to earn his place in his children's lives. Emma had rolled closer during their conversation and was now studying Robert's face with the same intense focus he remembered seeing in Isabella's eyes. The baby reached up toward his face, and Robert lowered his head so she could touch his cheek with tiny fingers. They need stability, Mrs. Martinez continued. They need consistency. They need a father who will be there not just when it's convenient, but when it's difficult. I want to be that father. Wanting and doing are different things. Isabella's been wanting a lot of things. To finish medical school, to give her babies a better life, to have a partner who supports her dreams instead of crushing them. But wanting doesn't make things happen. Robert spent another hour with Emma and Lucas, marveling at their personalities and fighting the growing ache in his chest every time they smiled at him. These were his children, and he had missed 4 months of their lives because he had been too self-absorbed to even consider the consequences of his actions. When Isabella's key turned in the lock that evening, she found Robert sitting on Mrs. Martinez's couch with Emma sleeping against his chest, while Lucas played with his tie. "What are you doing here?" she asked, but her voice lacked the anger he expected. "Learning," Robert said simply. "Learning about my children. Learning about you. Learning about what I've missed." Isabella looked exhausted, her cleaning uniform wrinkled and her hair escaping from its ponytail. But seeing her children content in their father's arms seemed to crack something in her defensive armor. "Mrs. Martinez has been telling me about your schedule," Robert continued. 3 jobs, online courses, medical journals. "Isabella, you're killing yourself." "I'm surviving," she corrected, but there was less fight in her voice than usual. "You're doing more than surviving. You're sacrificing everything for them. They're worth it. I know they are. And so are you." Isabella stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "What do you want, Robert?" "I want to help. Not with money, not by taking over, but by being here, by sharing the responsibility, by proving I can put them first." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Robert looked down at Emma, who had woken up, and was gazing at him with solemn eyes that mirrored his own. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out." For the first time since he had discovered the truth, Isabella didn't immediately shut him down. Instead, she studied his face with the same careful evaluation he had seen in Emma's eyes. "One chance," she said finally. "You get one chance to prove you're serious about this. What do I have to do? Show me you can change. Really change. Not just talk about it, but actually become the kind of man these children deserve to call their father." Robert nodded, understanding that this was the most important negotiation of his life, and success would be measured not in dollars or contracts, but in the trust of a woman who had every reason to doubt him and the love of 2 children who didn't even know his name. Robert's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began the very next morning when he did something unprecedented. He called his assistant and cleared his entire schedule for the week. "Sir, you have the Yamamoto merger meeting on Thursday," Monica protested. "And the board presentation on Friday is crucial for—" "Reschedule everything," Robert said firmly. "Tell them I have a family emergency." For the first time in his life, that wasn't a lie. He spent the morning researching pediatric development, reading articles about infant care, and learning about the challenges facing single mothers. By afternoon, he was standing outside Mrs. Martinez's door with bags of groceries and a carefully practiced speech about wanting to help. "You bought formula," Mrs. Martinez observed, examining his purchases. "Isabella breastfeeds, and you got newborn diapers. The babies are 4 months old." Robert felt his confidence deflate. I researched. "Research is good," Mrs. Martinez said gently. "But babies aren't business problems you can solve with data. They're people with individual needs, personalities, preferences." "Then teach me," Robert said, surprising them both with his earnestness. "Please. I want to learn everything." Mrs. Martinez studied his face, perhaps seeing something there that convinced her of his sincerity. "Isabella works late tonight. Office building downtown. The babies usually get fussy around dinner time." "What does that mean?" "It means you're about to find out what real responsibility feels like." For the next 4 hours, Robert received an intensive course in infant care. He learned that Emma preferred to be held facing outward so she could observe everything, while Lucas liked being rocked in gentle figure-8 motions. He discovered that changing diapers was more complex than he had imagined, that babies could cry for dozens of different reasons, and that his expensive silk ties made excellent teething toys. When both babies began crying simultaneously around 6 o'clock, Robert felt panic rising in his chest. "What did I do wrong?" he asked Mrs. Martinez desperately. "Nothing. They're tired, hungry, and overstimulated. This is normal. How do I make it stop?" "You don't. You comfort them through it." Robert found himself walking around the small apartment, holding Emma while Mrs. Martinez fed Lucas, both of them crying despite their efforts. His arms ached, his shirt was covered in various baby fluids, and he was beginning to understand why Isabella always looked exhausted. "How does she do this alone?" he asked, raising his voice over Emma's wails. "The same way thousands of single mothers do it every day," Mrs. Martinez replied. "Because she has to." When Isabella finally arrived home at 9 o'clock, she found Robert sitting on the floor with both babies, reading them a story from a medical journal because it was the only book Mrs. Martinez had on hand. Emma was chewing on his tie while Lucas had fallen asleep against his chest. "You look terrible," Isabella said, but her tone was softer than usual. "I feel terrible," Robert admitted. "How do you do this every day?" "Practice and desperation." Isabella sat down beside him, automatically reaching for Emma. "How long were they crying?" "About 2 hours total. Mrs. Martinez says that's normal, but it felt like forever." "It always feels like forever," Isabella said, and Robert caught something vulnerable in her voice. "Especially when you're alone and wondering if you're doing everything wrong." Robert looked at her profile as she settled Emma against her shoulder. "Do you ever regret it? Keeping them, I mean. Giving up medical school." Isabella was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "I regret the circumstances. I regret that their father wasn't someone who wanted to be a part of their lives from the beginning. But regret them? Never. What if their father had been different? What if he had been someone you could have built a life with? Then maybe I would have finished medical school. Maybe I would have become the pediatric surgeon I dreamed of being. Maybe a lot of things would have been different." Robert felt the weight of all the maybes, all the dreams he had inadvertently destroyed with his selfishness. "Isabella, I want to make this right." "You can't make it right, Robert. You can only try to make it better." The next few days fell into a routine that would have been unthinkable to Robert weeks earlier. He arrived at Mrs. Martinez's apartment each morning, learned to feed and change and comfort his children, and slowly began to understand the depth of responsibility that parenthood required. On Thursday, while Robert was giving Lucas a bottle, his phone rang with a call from Marcus. "Where the hell are you?" The Yamamoto meeting is in an hour, and their entire board flew in from Tokyo specifically for this. Robert looked down at Lucas, who was gazing up at him with perfect trust, tiny fingers wrapped around Robert's thumb. Handle it without me. Handle it without you? Robert, this is a $2 billion merger. Then handle it like the competent business partner I pay you to be. Have you lost your mind? This deal has been in development for 6 months. Robert felt a moment of his old anxiety, the familiar pull of business obligations and financial stakes. But then Lucas made a small, contented sound, and Robert realized that nothing about that merger mattered as much as this moment. Marcus, I'm exactly where I need to be. He hung up and turned off his phone. That sounded important, Mrs. Martinez observed from her chair. It used to be, Robert replied. But I'm starting to understand the difference between important and urgent. That afternoon, Isabella arrived early from work, looking worried. Mrs. Martinez called me. She said you turned down a major business meeting to stay with the babies. I did. Robert, you can't just abandon your responsibilities. I'm not abandoning my responsibilities. I'm finally understanding what they really are. Isabella stared at him, something shifting in her expression. This isn't sustainable. You can't just stop being a CEO because you discovered you have children. You're right, Robert said, carefully transferring a sleeping Emma to her carrier. I can't stop being a CEO, but I can stop being the kind of CEO who thinks business is more important than family. What does that mean? It means I'm restructuring my entire life. Delegating more, working from home when possible, making sure I'm available for the things that actually matter. And what if your business suffers? Robert looked at his children, then at Isabella's exhausted face, and felt a clarity he had never experienced before. Then it suffers. Some things are worth more than money, Isabella. It just took me 35 years to figure that out. Isabella sat down heavily in Mrs. Martinez's chair, studying Robert's face as if trying to determine whether his transformation was real or temporary. There's something else, Robert said, his voice growing more serious. I've been thinking about what you said, about proving I can change. I want to do more than just spend time with Emma and Lucas. What do you mean? I want to help you go back to school. Isabella's expression immediately became guarded. Robert, not by paying your way, not by throwing money at the problem, by being here, by being a real father so you can pursue your dreams without having to choose between your children and your future. That's impossible. Medical school is full-time, and childcare costs. What if childcare wasn't an issue? What if you had a partner who could share the responsibility? Isabella stared at him, and Robert could see her fighting between hope and skepticism. You're talking about co-parenting. I'm talking about being the father I should have been from the beginning. About making sure Emma and Lucas have both their parents, and making sure you get the chance to become the doctor you were meant to be. Robert, this isn't a business negotiation. You can't just decide to restructure your life and expect everyone else to fall in line. You're right. This isn't a negotiation. It's a promise. To you, to Emma, to Lucas, and to myself. I'm going to prove that people can change, that mistakes can be corrected, and that it's never too late to become the person you should have been all along. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, watching Robert hold their son while Emma slept peacefully nearby. One day at a time, she said finally. One day at a time, Robert agreed. Neither of them knew that their carefully constructed new reality was about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine, or that the biggest challenge to Robert's transformation was walking through the door at that very moment. The person who walked through Mrs. Martinez's door was the last person Robert expected to see. Victoria Ashford, his former girlfriend, wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people made in 6 months, and carrying herself with the entitled confidence that came from old money and older privilege. Robert, darling, Victoria said, her voice carrying that carefully modulated tone that suggested surprise while clearly indicating she had tracked him down deliberately. When your assistant said you were having a family emergency, I never imagined this. Her gaze swept over the modest apartment, taking in the baby toys scattered across the floor. Mrs. Martinez in her simple house dress, and Robert sitting on the carpet with Lucas in his lap, his expensive shirt stained with baby formula. Victoria, Robert said, instinctively moving to shield the babies from her penetrating stare. What are you doing here? saving you from making the biggest mistake of your life, apparently. Victoria's laugh was crystalline and cold. Robert, the entire business community is talking. You've missed 3 major meetings this week. Marcus is handling deals you should be closing personally, and rumors are circulating that you're having some kind of breakdown. Isabella, who had been feeding Emma in the corner, stood up slowly. Robert could see her taking in every detail of Victoria's appearance. The flawless makeup, the designer handbag, the kind of effortless elegance that money could buy and poverty could never achieve. "And you are?" Victoria asked, directing her attention to Isabella with the kind of polite dismissal she might use on service staff. "Isabella Rodriguez," Isabella replied, her voice steady but cautious. "Ah, the maid." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "How convenient that you've managed to ensnare Robert with this little domestic fantasy." "Victoria," Robert warned, standing up with Lucas still in his arms. "That's enough." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like someone has taken advantage of your temporary guilt to manipulate you into playing house." Victoria moved closer, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Robert, darling, I understand you're feeling responsible, but this isn't you. This isn't your world." Mrs. Martinez had been watching the exchange with growing disapproval. "Perhaps this conversation should continue elsewhere," she suggested firmly. "Actually, I think Isabella should hear this," Victoria said, turning back to face her. "Because someone needs to explain to her how these situations typically work in our circles." "Our circles?" Isabella repeated, and Robert heard something dangerous in her tone. "Robert's world, dear, where there are proper ways to handle complications like this. Generous financial settlements, excellent private schools, trust funds for the children. Everyone gets what they need without anyone having to pretend this could ever be a real relationship." The silence in the room was deafening. Robert felt his old life and his new reality colliding with devastating force, and he realized this was the test Isabella had been waiting for, not of his ability to change diapers or miss business meetings, but of whether he would defend their family when his old world came calling. "Victoria, you need to leave," Robert said, his voice deadly quiet. "Robert, be practical. You're a billionaire CEO, not a suburban father. This woman is a cleaning lady with 2 babies who will never fit into your real life. You're not doing anyone any favors by pretending otherwise. I said leave. And what about the Yamamoto deal? What about the board meeting you missed? What about your responsibility to the company your father built?" Robert felt the familiar pull of obligation, the weight of expectations that had driven him his entire life. But then he looked at Isabella's face and saw something that made his chest tighten. Not anger, but resignation. She was already pulling back, already protecting herself from the inevitable disappointment. "The company will survive without me for a few days," Robert said firmly. "A few days?" Victoria laughed. "Robert, this isn't a few days. This is you choosing to throw away everything you've worked for because of a guilty conscience and a pretty face. This is me choosing my family." "Family?" Victoria's voice rose with incredulity. "You've known these children existed for less than a week. You barely know this woman. How can you call them family?" Robert looked down at Lucas, who was gazing up at him with complete trust, then at Emma, who had crawled over to grab at his shoelaces. These tiny human beings who carried his DNA, who would grow up calling someone else daddy if he walked away now. "Because they are my family," he said simply. "They're my children, and Isabella is their mother. And that makes us connected in a way that's more important than any business deal or social expectation." Victoria stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "You're not thinking clearly. The stress of discovery, the guilt. It's making you irrational. Come back to your real life, Robert."
"Let me help you handle this properly. My real life is right here. Your real life is board meetings and charity galas and building the empire your father left you. Your real life is not sitting on the floor of a queen's apartment playing with babies who will only hold you back from everything you're meant to achieve."
Robert felt something crystallize inside him, a clarity that had nothing to do with obligation or expectation and everything to do with choice. "You're wrong, Victoria. This is exactly what I'm meant to achieve." He handed Lucas to Mrs. Martinez and walked to Isabella, taking her hands in his despite her attempt to pull away. "Isabella, don't listen to her. Don't let her make you doubt what we're building. "What are we building, Robert?" Isabella asked quietly. "Because she's not wrong about the differences between our worlds. We're building a family. We're building a life where our children grow up knowing they're loved by both parents. We're building something real. And when the novelty wears off, when you remember who you really are and what you really want, when you realize that changing diapers and midnight feedings and sick babies aren't as romantic as you thought they'd be," Robert could see the fear in Isabella's eyes, the certainty that this transformation was temporary, that eventually he would revert to being the man who had walked away from her once before. "Isabella, I can't promise you that this will be easy. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, or that I'll always know the right thing to do. But I can promise you that I will never again walk away from you or our children." "Promises are easy to make," Victoria interjected. "But when the board of directors starts questioning your judgment, when investors begin pulling out because you're perceived as unstable, when your entire empire starts crumbling because you're distracted by domestic concerns, what then?" As if summoned by her words, Robert's phone began ringing insistently. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and Robert could imagine the crisis that had prompted the call. "Answer it," Victoria said smugly. "Answer it, and tell me your children are more important than whatever fire needs to be put out." Robert looked at the phone, then at Isabella's face, then at his children playing contentedly on Mrs. Martinez's floor. He made a choice that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He turned off the phone and placed it on Mrs. Martinez's coffee table. "Robert!" Victoria gasped. "That could be about the Yamamoto deal collapsing, or the board calling for an emergency meeting, or any number of crises that need your immediate attention. Then Marcus will handle it, or the board will handle it, or the company will adapt and survive like businesses have been doing for centuries." Robert looked directly at Isabella. "But I will not sacrifice another moment with my family for a business that existed before I was born and will exist after I'm gone." Victoria stared at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. "You've lost your mind. You're throwing away billions of dollars for what? A fantasy of domestic bliss with someone who will never understand your world?" "No," Robert said, still holding Isabella's hands. "I'm trading a world that never made me happy for a chance at something that might." The transformation was complete, and everyone in the room could see it. This wasn't a temporary bout of guilt or a midlife crisis. It was a fundamental shift in who Robert Blackwood chose to be. 6 months later, Robert's penthouse had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Baby toys scattered across Italian marble floors, high chairs positioned next to his dining table, and the sound of laughter echoing through rooms that had once known only silence. Isabella sat at his kitchen island, medical textbooks spread before her, while Emma and Lucas played in their high-tech but sensibly priced playpen nearby. She was back in school, enrolled in an accelerated pre-med program that would allow her to complete her degree in 3 years instead of 4. "How was your day?" Robert asked, walking in from his home office where he now conducted most of his business. He had restructured Blackwood Industries completely, delegating operational control to Marcus while maintaining strategic oversight. The company was more profitable than ever, proving that his constant micromanagement had been ego, not necessity. "Dr. Peterson said my latest exam scores were the highest in the class," Isabella replied, not looking up from her anatomy textbook. "And before you ask, yes, I'm sure I can handle the workload." Robert smiled, recognizing the defensive tone she still used when discussing her academic achievements. Some habits took longer to break than others. "I never doubted it," he said, picking up Lucas, who immediately began trying to grab his father's nose. "What I was going to ask is whether you'd like me to cook dinner tonight." Isabella looked up in surprise. "You know how to cook." "I'm learning. Mrs. Martinez has been giving me lessons. Apparently, ordering takeout every night isn't sustainable when you have children. Another skill they don't teach at Harvard Business School? Along with changing diapers, midnight feeding schedules, and the fact that sometimes the most important meeting of your day is reading Goodnight Moon for the 15th time." Isabella's smile was genuine now, the guarded wariness that had defined their early interactions replaced by something warmer. They weren't a couple, both had been clear about that boundary, but they had become something more important, true partners in raising their children. "Robert," Isabella said suddenly, closing her textbook, "I have something to tell you." His heart stopped. "What is it?" "I got into Johns Hopkins. full scholarship to their pediatric surgery program. Isabella, that's incredible. Robert's joy was immediate and complete. When do you start? That's the thing. It's in Baltimore. I'd have to move. Robert felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with losing something important, but it was quickly replaced by determination. Then we moved to Baltimore. We, Emma and Lucas, need both their parents. And you need support while you're in one of the most demanding programs in the country. Robert looked at his children, then at the woman who had taught him what truly mattered. Besides, Blackwood Industries has been talking about expanding our East Coast operations. Isabella stared at him for a long moment. You'd relocate your entire life? I'd relocate to Mars if that's what it took to make sure our children grow up knowing they're loved by both parents and that their mother achieved every dream she ever had. Emma chose that moment to take her first unsteady steps, wobbling from her playpen toward Isabella with arms outstretched. Both parents reached for her simultaneously, their hands touching as they steadied their daughter. "Thank you," Isabella whispered, and Robert knew she wasn't just talking about Baltimore. "Thank you for teaching me what wealth really means," he replied. "It's not what you accumulate. It's what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love." As their children laughed and played around them, Robert realized that the millionaire who had once caught his maid carrying his twins had discovered something worth more than any fortune. A family built on love, respect, and the courage to choose what truly matters. The man who had almost thrown away his greatest treasure had learned to recognize real wealth when he saw it.